May we remind you to switch off all electronic equipment till you are inside the...
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tribhuvan International Airport, Kathmandu, Nepal. Attention please.
Today's guest is Tim Gocher, founder and CEO at the Dolma Impact Fund. Dolma Fund Management manages two private equity funds for Nepal. They provide a growth capital to small and medium-sized enterprises, renewable energy projects, healthcare, and technology sectors. Hi, Tim. Nice to meet you. And thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, David.
I heard that you have great news, right, about the fund.
I have
Fundraising, right?
Great news. So we've just achieved first close of our second private equity fund for Nepal, Dolma Impact Fund II. We've closed at 40 million. We are in due diligence for second close, and we have a target of 75 million.
Wow, that's great news, right?
It's great news. Fundraising in the pandemic is, especially for a frontier market where investors, LPs like to obviously visit the country and touch and feel the opportunity.
I understand. They have a more criteria box on the checklist for frontier market, right? As
That's
compared
right.
to, so they need to check more.
I applaud them because obviously most of them did this by video. Some visited before the pandemic, but you know, I suppose everybody, GPs, LPs, had to innovate, or the world would stop. And so we managed to have a process which worked largely over video.
Yeah, very good news. And you don't have a Nepalese passport, right?
I do not. I am a British citizen. Currently stuck here in the UK because, of course, the pandemic is raging in Nepal at the moment. But I have very close ties to Nepal.
Yeah, that is my question. Why Nepal? And then please tell us a little bit about your journey to the founding Dolma Fund in Nepal, not in UK, not in Japan, not in the US. But it's an interesting backstory.
Well, my first trip to Nepal was in 2003, and I simply went as a tourist. I went and fell in love with the country. It's obviously one of the most beautiful scenic countries in the world. I think what I didn't realize is culturally just how peaceful the people were. Now, I started a non-profit, a British charity, which is still very much going. It helps with, it's called Dolma Foundation. It supports, it has over 100 scholarships running for some of the most disadvantaged students in Nepal. And we helped very much after the earthquake, and we're helping now with the pandemic. But that got me involved in Nepal. Meanwhile, I am a private sector person, an investment executive, and I was living a double life. I was on the 1 minute investing in Asian shopping malls, and the next minute flying off to little villages in Nepal to help with education. And I really wanted to bring those two lives together. And as Nepal has progressed politically and economically, by 2011, it became obvious that what Nepal really needed was a private sector investment fund that could fill the gap where banks are not able to lend to smaller companies, and we can come in with risk capital, equity, preferred equity, and invest in the incredible talent that I was meeting in Nepal. And that's what led us to the first close of our first fund in 2014.
I see. Please tell us a little bit about your fund. Is it venture capital, private equity, or infrastructure fund? I have seen the portfolios all related to all these three in your fund, right? So can you tell us a little bit what is the investment strategy and thesis of your fund?
It is all three.
Right.
Now, your first response might be, hang on a minute, how do you do venture capital, private equity, and infrastructure? I think what we do as one of the first funds focused on the country is really look at where the opportunities are. And I mean opportunities commercially, but also for impact. And those are very much linked, because where the demand is usually where the need in society is most. So we have three sectors, and I'll go through them because the first is technology.
Yes.
And that is a huge demand for things like e-commerce, where we have an investment in the number 2 e-commerce player, Sasta Deal. We have 2 AI investments where companies are really innovating, providing services to foreign, mostly Western customers in AI services and software development. And moving forward with our second fund, of course, the pandemic has thrown up a huge need for technology and things like fintech, which will be a focus of ours going forward. So those are very much venture capital deals, and that's where we had our first exit. Our first exit was from one of those AI companies. So those are VC. Now, healthcare is the second sector. Even before COVID, it was very apparent that healthcare is hugely underserved, the healthcare requirement, especially outside of the Kathmandu Valley. So we do already have an investment in a hospital and a pharmaceutical company. And in our second fund, we're really looking to branch out to sort of clinics in some of the provincial areas, but also using health tech, remote diagnostics, AI, telemedicine, things that can really get healthcare services out without the fixed infrastructure that's often required. So you can leapfrog these solutions. So some of those are venture capital if it's health tech, some of those are more traditional private equity if it's a hospital.
Yes. Yeah.
And then finally, we invest in renewables. When I moved to Nepal in 2015, and we lived there for a few years, my wife is Nepali. I don't know if I mentioned that, but that is a very close link that I have to the country. And we lived there. It was a wonderful place to live. But at the time, there was 16 hours a day of power cuts, of load shedding. So it gives you an idea of the demand for power. We have in our first fund invested in 2 hydropower plants, which are almost complete, 2 solar plants, and we'll be investing more and more in renewable energy. That is obviously in demand, but it's really a climate change story as well, because the emissions, especially the black carbon, as it's called, which comes out of the dirty vehicles, the wood burning fires all over the country because people don't have enough power, and the coal-fired powers over the border in India, which Nepal imports the power from, is settling on the glaciers, and it's warming the glaciers, and that's causing these catastrophic floods that you see in February in Uttarakhand, that flash flood, for example. But every monsoon you see the rainfall added to the glacial melt water, which is creating huge problems, not just for Nepal, but for Bangladesh and bordering states of India. So the faster we can get clean energy out there to meet demand, the safer the glaciers and the people below them will be.
Gotcha. So infrastructure investment is very straightforward, pretty much a corporate banking, corporate investment process, right? It's because it's a project financing type of opportunity. You can run the spreadsheet, check the cash flow, check the legal structure, et cetera. But about the venture capital or private equity deal, how do you identify the right opportunity or right entrepreneur to work with through the investment?
I think the most important thing of those you mentioned is the right entrepreneur.
Right.
You can often see trends. We only need to look across the border into India to see the trends of e-commerce, the trends of fintech, the trends of AI. Of course, Nepal is unique and it's a unique market, but you can see the global trends of these technology platform plays. What you need to find is the entrepreneur.
Right.
And in
but
Nepal,
that's a good answer, but a very popular answer. But challenge is that how can we define and find the right entrepreneur? That's a difficult, probably topic, right?
How do you find the right entrepreneur? Nepal, the thing that surprised me most about Nepal is the talent. And you think it might be a really isolated place, but the amount of talent which has either picked up Western entrepreneurial culture, or perhaps has been studying or working in the UK, US, abroad, and has come back with ideas. There's a significant number, and this is a growing culture, and it is in any country at the moment with the rise of the internet and the cloud. So we haven't really had a shortage of talent. And I think that overrides a lot of what we do. That's not just the entrepreneur.
Actually, Rahul mentioned the same answer. He said the
Yeah.
same answer. A lot of, I mean, talents, a lot of talents. No shortage of talents. Yeah.
Just go a step deeper into what I just said. That's finding the entrepreneurs. But let's say you set up an AI software development company, as Fuse Machines, one of our investees, is. How do you find 200 AI software developers that can work in virtual teams for American companies? You know, that talent is there too. It does take some work. There is an education gap. So it does take some work. That example I gave you, they train people for a year. They have a specific online offline mix course to bridge the gap between perhaps their graduation and what's expected of the workforce in the countries they're working in virtually. But the talent is there, right? Talent is distributed equally, opportunities are not.
I see. Sounds like you have all the popular industry, popular business in Nepal as well, just like fintech, AI, and then the e-commerce. Those are the most popular business people investors talk about these days. But I understand Nepal has 30 million people, almost 30 million people. It is a quite sizable market, but in terms of purchasing power, maybe is much smaller than as compared to the large or developed economy. So do you find a lot of entrepreneur or startup who are active looking for the opportunity, expand their business outside of Nepal as well? Because that makes the differentiation in terms of valuation, right?
Yes, to an extent it makes a difference in terms of valuation. I think you've got to look at the demand you already have in country.
Yes.
At least, you know, we're not investing in, you know, manufacturing plants that would realistically export. We do have a manufacturing plant in pharmaceuticals, but the demand is so high in Nepal that what you're really doing is substituting exports rather than realistically, substituting imports from mostly India rather than exporting to other countries. So in our Nepal focused markets, be it energy, healthcare, medicines, e-commerce, these are areas where there is undersupply and over demand. And that is one of the most exciting things about Nepal. You're really bringing ideas, products, services to the market where you can bring quality and differentiate yourself. It's not as crowded as perhaps India. And you can see more directly the impact that, you know, renewable energy, turning the lights on in a home or a business for the first time can have, you know, providing medicines to people that they perhaps wouldn't otherwise had or more expensive if it was imported. So I think you've got plenty of demand with a 30 million population. It's the size of Malaysia.
That's the size of population. It is.
And you've plenty of demand. Nepal, before COVID, was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. I think, according to the World Bank, between 6.2 and 8% the 3 years before. And that just gives you an idea of the, again, untapped demand which is coming from the country. The thing that we have found success with exports is in technology services abroad. These aren't BPOs. These are providing services to technology companies in the US, using that talent base in the US for strategic software development, for the managing of data for AI, things like that. So using the sort of technology growth where the internet and the cloud have created this wonderful equality, you know, does it really matter if you're in California or Kathmandu?
Yeah.
And I think that is where we have had some success in exports rather than sort of heavy industrial exports.
I agree. As I told you, I worked in Nepal in 1995 and 1996. So I share the same opinion. And then Nepal has a huge potential, indeed, especially individual Nepalese. There are a lot of small people, right? So many related economic development, there are many reasons to consider. But for startup, they can go beyond that, right? They can expand and grow the business inside of Nepal as well as outside, and collaborating with their buyer, customer in other part of the world. So I agree. Yeah. Okay, and could you please tell us a little, about any interesting portfolio company you have invested in the past and then you're bullish about?
Yeah, there are many. There are 9 companies in our portfolio across those 3 sectors. I think one of the most visionary is Cloud Factory. Cloud Factory was built on the vision of creating meaningful work for 1 million people. So through AI. And before I do that, we're called an impact fund. So, I want to define what that means to us, because it means different things to different people, and then go on to describe the story of Cloud Factory and why that fits so well. We are looking for risk-adjusted market returns. We are a commercial private equity fund, and that's what's expected from our LPs. But in a country like Nepal, which of course is very poor, there's a very high synergy between commercial success and impact success, especially if you're investing in tech that creates a lot of jobs and knowledge transfer in the economy, healthcare, obviously, renewables, obviously. So we're an impact fund and we measure our benchmarks, employment, taxes paid, CO2 avoided, etc. And then we measure it on a regular basis going forward. I met the founder and CEO, Mark Sears, of Cloud Factory. He started a business in Nepal, and it became a way of using that talent to build software which managed tasks for AI work. And specifically the AI work is managing data sets for mostly American AI companies. And some of that can be really simple work. It could be clicking on photos of roads for self-driving car algorithms. So it's created a range of jobs, and in Nepal, it's created over 3,000 jobs. And they range, of course, from software developers building the platform down to people that, cloud workers, as we call them, which are, clicking and annotating databases or photographs for algorithms. But I don't want to underplay the importance of that whole range of work in the Nepali workforce. Every year, hundreds of thousands of Nepalis leave to work abroad. And some of those semi-skilled, maybe they've got a basic education, maybe they speak English, instead of either going into laboring jobs or going abroad, they've now got an opportunity to work in a Western type managed company, to work for American clients, and to work up. And wherever they go in life, they've learned those skills of project management, of quality control. And Cloud Factory is well on their way to now creating that 1 million person workforce in the developing world. So it was a vision we shared. We found the quality of entrepreneurs, and the growth has been spectacular.
Yeah, sounds like an interesting and a strong business model. Yeah.
Very.
Okay, so my last question is, what can you expect from you and the Dolma Fund this year? And what is your long-term vision for the Dolma Fund and probably Dolma Foundation as well?
Well, they're very separate things, but let's talk about the Dolma Impact Fund. Over the next few years, we have already exited from one of our portfolio companies, or partially. We expect now, with the completion of the renewable energy projects and the maturity of some of those businesses over the next few years, to have more and more exit data points while we deploy our second fund in our 3 verticals. So what I see is really de-risking Nepal. And by de-risking, I mean just creating data points of transactions and return against risk. And I think that is the opportunity has always been there. What's difficult for investors to access is when there's a lack of transactions to benchmark, what is the risk-adjusted rate of return for Nepal?
Right.
And we can provide that answer. We've now got nearly 7 years of track record.
Yes.
I also think, as well as the commercial returns, which we've in part already proved, what people can see is the clear impact. I follow the sustainability impact capital stories very much, and sometimes I feel that it's money sloshing around the OECD. And I'll make a comparison. if you build a new solar plant in Spain, you might replace a very efficient gas-fired power station. If you build a solar plant in Nepal, you're switching the lights on for the first time for homes and businesses who will no longer burn firewood, pollute the environment, the children can do their homework, people can start businesses. That's impact.
Yes.
And the investors who are naturally risk averse, the institutional private sector investors, naturally risk averse. They're managing your and my pension probably.
They have the same checklist, same criteria and the same checklist.
But if they really want to meet the SDGs, if they really want to have an impact, they need to find a way to manage that risk, to get into the poorer parts of the world where that impact is much clearer. And I hope what we're providing as a fund manager is the bridge and the track record to help them at least evaluate that risk and apply a return that would apply to that risk. And that's our long-term goal. Nepal needs to meet the SDGs something like $2 to $3 billion a year in foreign direct investment. It currently gets between 1 and 200 million. Our goal is to bring large institutional investors into Nepal, to give them exposure to the incredible growth and impact, and obviously to manage their risk. And we're doing that every day, one step at a time.
Sounds great. Yeah. And in fact, underwriting process of large investment fund and commercial bank is not right? For example, as the S&P, the Moody's, and a way to give the credit rating to the borrower, they usually check the sovereign rating of the country first, and then that they give a lower rating to all the private company. But before the Asian financial crisis, even SMEs in Korea, tiny SMEs, they have a good credit rating. But I see that a lot of SMEs continue to default, right? But they have, because of their metrics, because the process like a factory, right, conveyor belt, they give a good credit rating. Top triple Bs, if they issue the bond, they pay only the 1 or 2%, 1% of a US dollar interest rate on top of the LIBOR. That's crazy. But if you look at the emerging frontier market like Nepal, because of country has the nation has a very low country credit rating, all the private sector company, even though they're very strong, I mean, they're using the common sense. I don't think they will have a high possibility going default, but they have non-investment grade, right? That's nonsense. Actually, I argue against that. I mean, the typical banks investor, the underwriting process, using the example of Nepal a lot in the past.
Well, that's fascinating. Slight correction, Nepal doesn't have a low credit rating. It has no credit rating.
Okay.
And so when you approach very often institutional investors, the first thing they'll look up is the Bloomberg, on Bloomberg, what's the sovereign credit rating? It's simply that they haven't issued international sovereign bonds, and therefore there is no traded yield on which to base the whole valuation and cost of capital.
Right.
But that doesn't mean, and so often people will think no credit rating must be like Afghanistan or Somalia. No, it's not. The Nepal Electricity Authority, the sole buyer of electricity, has never...
Emirates Airline, one of the largest airline company, they recently, less 10 years, they never got the credit rating. Probably the reason is a strategy. If they got the credit rating, probably pretty low, that's try to avoid them. But still, the kind of interesting example to what you explained.
That's right. So yes, there are moves in the country to issue debt. Of course, COVID has perhaps parked a lot of things. But I think therefore the international capital market valuation risk metrics do not apply to Nepal.
It's basically is too oversimplified. I think oversimplified to smart people. Box ticking process, right?
I'll finish by saying this. We ran a correlation of the Nepal Stock Exchange over the last two financial crises, 2008, 2009, and the recent stock market crash last year with COVID. And the correlation between NEPSI, the Nepal index, and the S&P 500 and the FTSE 100 in London was 0. Literally 0.01, something like that. And what that tells you is that these decoupled markets have a value to an international portfolio. We
Yeah.
all learn at business school portfolio diversification, all
Yeah.
based on the capital asset pricing model, all based on the risk-free rate of return. And look what happened to international global markets during those two crises. They all go in lockstep.
That is a very interesting
In
point.
Nepal,
A
it's-
very interesting point.
there is a value to that decoupling. It's not negatively correlated, but there's a value to that non-correlation to an international portfolio. And I think
Bulletproof, right?
exactly. And I think that's not realized in international markets.
That's a very good point. I'll keep that in mind and share with my friend who are running an investment fund. That's a good point. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking time to sharing the interesting your professional journey in Nepal, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share with a friend, and drop me a review. Goodbye.